The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, a look at what happened to Transit City and why building public transportation in this province takes so long. Then, J.N. Jagannathan speaks to writer Tim Falconer about one of Ontario's biggest mining scandals. That's all ahead on the agenda. Over 19 seasons of the agenda, one of the most widely debated issues has been transit. A plan called Transit City launched 18 years ago. In the intervening years, the City of Toronto and its transit funding partners have had many plans and stops and starts and stops and starts on infrastructure building to move people around the GTHA. With us for another look, let's welcome, from Victoria, British Columbia, David Miller, the former mayor of Toronto and managing director of the C40 Centre for City Climate Policy and Economy. And here in our studio, Jennifer Keesmaat, president and CEO of the Collective Marquee Company. That's a sustainable housing development group. She, of course, Toronto's former chief planner. And John Lawrence, urban affairs journalist, and we are delighted to have you two back here in our studio. And former Mayor Miller, great to have you on our program too. It's been a long time.
I'm delighted to be back. Thanks, Steve.
Let's start with this. We want to do, Sheldon, you want to put this graphic up? We're going to do a bit of a timeline here on Transit City, just to give everybody this little walk down memory lane. We're going back to 2007. Transit City, conceived by then Mayor Miller and then TTC Commissioner Adam Giambrone. It got approved. It included the Eglinton Crosstown LRT, the Finch West LRT, the Shepherd East LRT, the Scarborough LRT. Much of this is going to sound familiar, right, folks? In 2009, the Ontario government announced $8.6 billion in funding for those lines. Also in 2009, Metrolinx took ownership of the LRT lines, though they would be they'd be operated by the Toronto Transit Commission, the TTC. In 2010, Rob Ford mayoral campaign promised subways, 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 and thus putting Transit City into question. In 2010, after Rob Ford became the mayor, Transit City funding was cut and the projects deferred or canceled. They are in some state of completion now. In 2025, Eglinton Crosstown suspected for September. I'll believe it when I see it. Finch West sometime 2025. Scarborough Extension 2030. Anyway, we'll see if any of this ever happens. You two have both got smiles on your faces. David Miller, take us back. Transit City, what was its original mission as you conceived it?
Well, the importance of Transit City was to try to build a city which people did not have to own a car. A car is an expensive thing. Traffic is a huge issue in Toronto. And in order to allow people to live in the city without being obliged to have a car, you need a transit network. And I think the real insight of Transit City was we used the actual data by our planning department and the data kept by the TTC about bus ridership to both project where rapid transit was needed in the future and where the demand was today, which not surprisingly tended to be in low-income neighborhoods. And the insight was we could build a transit system within a generation that created a network around the city if we used predominantly light rail at grade, in some places tunneled where it had to be, like parts of the Eglinton line. So we used real data, real projections about potential growth where we could build new housing in an affordable way in the city, and technology that was affordable and could be built rapidly. That was at least the plan.
Jennifer Keesmaat, let me put it this way. Philosophically, why is it so important to the smooth functioning of the Greater Toronto Area to have a properly functioning transit system? We'll go back to first principles on that. What's the answer?
Well, I think David outlined it in his introduction, is that a city is a dense urban place. We've demonstrated our city is continually adding more people. We're evolving the urban form. It's getting denser and denser. It's a physics problem if you continue to assume that people will get around in cars. There is not enough room. So foundational to the evolving city is creating great places where it's possible to get from anywhere to anywhere on a transit network that is convenient, that typically has One transfer is usually the easiest way to move. You can, if you transfer once, and you can get anywhere to anywhere, and it also needs to be affordable. In order for those things to work, you also need frequency, you need reliability. There's a whole variety of layers. It's not just about the line on the map. How frequently the bus comes or how frequently the LRT comes is really critical as well. But it really goes back to that foundational piece of providing the option of creating a city where it's convenient, safe to get around anywhere to anywhere without a car. Without a car. That's the foundation.
So, John, let's go back 15 years. Rob Ford becomes the mayor. He decides the accent ought to be on subways and not LRTs. What did that do to the vision that Jen Keesmaat just laid out?
Well, one of the very first things he did in office was basically call in the TTC chief general manager and ask him to down tools on the Transit City project. With the exception, there was some backing and forthing about this, about the Eglinton Crosstown line. And then we spent a lot of time trying to figure out whether it was financially feasible to create the subway system that he envisioned. At some points it was very grandiose. It was going to be a big loop at one point along Shepherd. And, you know, he had appointed an advisor to kind of run the numbers and discovered that the math doesn't work. And so we were in a situation where the plan that had been sort of put forward by former Mayor Miller that had gotten some but not all the funding it needed was basically stuck in neutral. And then we went through this elaborate process of trying to figure out what to do next.
Well, let's go down memory lane a little more. Karen Stintz, you all know, she's actually a former candidate for national office not too long ago. Former TDC chair, former Toronto City Councillor, former mayoral candidate. She was on this program 13 years ago talking about all of this, and here's what she had to say. Sheldon, roll it if you would.
I think also we have to acknowledge the things that you're talking about, like vision for transit, vision for the waterfront, those types of longer term strategies, they're not one-term decisions. Mm-hmm. And so at some point we need to figure out as a city, how do we actually agree that we've made a decision? Right? Mm-hmm. Because we did actually have a plan. It was fully funded. And a mayor was elected who didn't agree with that plan, and for reasons that are legitimate. But now we found ourselves 2 years doing nothing, and again facing difficult decisions in council where there's this appearance of opposition, and I don't think it's very difficult to break through that.
So, David Miller, the question becomes, in a democracy, when politicians change, because elections have consequences, how do you get anything built if one council wants to change its mind from the previous council, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, it's a tough question because it's at the heart of democracy. I mean, the people who are elected should be making the decisions. I think one of the things we've seen, you know, Transit City has stood the test of time, even though not all of it is being built, because we went about it the right way with using real data and real projections. We didn't draw political lines on a map to benefit somebody. And I think, you know, we're seeing Finch being built, Eglinton shockingly slowly, but, you know, it will open, I think, probably next year, actually not this year, because that was the approach. And I think that's part of my answer to your question. A second answer is, in the end, it's up to people. You know, the city government, the public service, whoever's elected at the time, the mayor of the day, can do their level best to build something that has longevity. In a different example, we certainly did that with the environment strategies, which have stood the test of time, as has the environment department in the city. But in the end, it's up to people, and people really want a high-functioning, excellent transit system in Toronto. And, you know, perhaps one of the things that was unfortunate about Transit City was it wasn't far enough under construction when I left office that people were going to speak up and demand that it be continued. We'd invested about $100 million or so in construction on Shepherd, which was thrown away when it was canceled. But that had been construction behind the scenes, things like moving sewers. People couldn't see a line. And, you know, it's a reminder that in government, you really do have to give people something they can see, feel, and touch. And then they'll demand much more of it. And I really expect once Finch and Eglinton open, we'll see the people of Toronto saying, now we understand we want more. We want to ensure this network reaches every part of the city so everybody can have access to higher order rapid transit.
Well, let me follow up with Jennifer on that. Does it look like the way it's unfolding, like there is some sensible vision at play, or are we just sort of ad hoc this, ad hoc that? I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I'll fill in a little gap from what David Miller was just talking about, because it was Transit City, and then, and in part it's a little bit of an answer to your question about, well, how do you bridge these political cycles, and how do you build a public understanding and capacity for a longer term vision? Because if you do that, then you won't see politicians elected who are deviating from a vision that people understand. One of the reasons why someone can show up and say, hey, this is a crappy plan, we shouldn't do this, is if the public doesn't know about it and they don't support it and they don't see the value of it. And that was one of the reasons why the very first thing I did as chief planner was launch Feeling Congested, which was all about linking together a whole bunch of different modalities, subway, LRT, transit, King Street was a transit priority corridor, linking all those things together and building capacity both on city council as well for understanding the importance of building out a network and for linking together the secret sauce that Toronto has always had. We've always been the city where you can move seamlessly from the subway to a streetcar to a bus. That at a point in time, that was really unique to the city of Toronto. And people came from around the world to look at how we linked together these different modalities. And so the plan that we created, which is actually the plan that's being built out right now, is a plan that builds out the priorities from that Feeling Congested exercise, which includes the Relief Line, which is now the Ontario line. It includes Eglinton LRT, which we reconfigured somewhat, including putting more of it below ground. It includes Finch. It includes some extensions into the suburbs. And what we did to build capacity with the public for that plan was we focused on our objectives. What are we seeking to achieve with transit? We prioritized social equity. We prioritized sustainability. We prioritized strong neighborhoods. And then we layered in, as was done earlier with Transit City, we layered in the data to demonstrate and to essentially sort. We had 23 projects to sort those projects based on those key priorities. And we went out to the public and said, how much does social equity matter? How much does sustainability matter? How much does walkable neighborhoods matter? And then a sorting exercise took place. We layered that in with the technical analysis. And that's why the Relief Line, now the Ontario line, actually became the #1 project and it is under construction in the city.
No,
the whole city is
you see it.
Construction.
Yep.
It's everywhere right now. It is well underway, under construction. And that was about preventing system failure at Interchange Station at Bloor.
Let me pick that up on that with you, John. If you have to see it to believe in it, as we've talked about here already, when the public, as they do and as they have over the last many years, sees an Eglinton Crosstown still not open, years after it was promised to be open, other transit projects still well behind schedule, still well over budget, how do you garner public support for this kind of stuff when it just looks like we're surrounded by, I don't want to say failure, but it's not great, right?
No, very not great. I think it's a good question. The provincial government is spending a lot of money on transit, on the GO Rail network, on the Ontario line.
Tens of billions
of dollars. And eventually, all of that money will gestate into something that begins to be a network. I think what the public sees a lot more of is really frustrating traffic congestion. And what I wish the public and the politicians would talk about more is why those two things are connected. And then take it to another place, which is to ask the question whether we're building transit properly. My hypothesis is that we put all our eggs in this big basket called Infrastructure Ontario and Triple Ps, and it's done precisely the opposite of what it's promised to do, which was on time, on budget. And there was a study that came out of U of T last year which compared Toronto transit construction on a per kilometer basis to a lot of other cities around the world, and we are absolutely at the bottom of the list. So it's not like we're trying to figure out how to get to Jupiter. These are things that are done in many places around the world,
Just not
many
here.
more congested places, and we just keep making the same mistake over and over again.
Well, let me ask about, I'll ask David Miller about format here, in as much as John mentioned triple Ps, public-private partnerships. There were days when governments sort of organized the projects themselves and then were responsible for bringing them in on time and on budget. Now there's some kind of amalgam of public and private partnerships, alternative financing programs. There's lots of different beasts out there. Can you tell if, one of these works better than another, and if so, which one?
Yes, I think you can tell, and it's quite clear from the Toronto context that the model of so-called public-private partnerships has failed. And there's a whole history within Transit City. There's not enough time to go into detail, but the short version is the TTC had done something like 65 to 80% of the design of the Eglinton LRT, preparing it for a more traditional process when the province decided to take it over and redo all the work, literally to PPP it. And it's clearly been a failure in terms of delays and cost overruns. But I think it actually speaks to a bigger picture, Steve. What Jennifer and I were speaking to was the ability of the City of Toronto to create transit plans that answered your question. How do you have longevity and consistency in something that takes more than one term of council to properly plan and deliver? And the answer to both of those was the City of Toronto and its agency, the Toronto Transit Commission, need to be the ones who plan the future of transit in this city on behalf of the people who live here and elect city council and the mayor. And what we've seen is the province through Metrolinx literally take over that responsibility. And I think there's legislation that says the TTC is not allowed to be involved on its own in transit planning now, which is perverse. And I think a lot of these problems can be traced not just to the PPP model, but the fact that we have a provincial agency who is accountable to politicians from Kingston and Kapuskasing, not to people elected to serve the needs of Torontonians, which is making decisions. So we see some good projects being built. The part of the Ontario line that goes between downtown and Don Mills, very important. Eglinton, very important. Finch, very important. But we don't yet have a network. Scarborough in particular doesn't have the LRT lines it should and it needs. And to me, it's because the decisions are being made at Queen's Park instead of inside the City of Toronto by the people we elect as Torontonians, where those decisions and plans should be made.
Well,
and it's dysfunctional and it's a recipe for mistakes.
John wants in on that.
Well, I mean, I think that I understand the logic in that argument, but if you step back and look at what has happened politically, it's been regime change at the City of Toronto and therefore at the TTC that has created this sort of flip-flopping. I'm not in love with Infrastructure Ontario and the approach that is currently underway. But if we can imagine 3 years from now that the Ford government is defeated by a Liberal government or an NDP government, it's very unlikely that they are going to suddenly discontinue the Ontario line or the other big projects that are in play. That continuity will be present. Because
that did happen 30 years ago.
Yeah,
and they
I mean,
built the tunnels for the Eglinton line, and then the Harris government filled them in.
Yeah.
So this does happen.
Yeah.
David Miller, go ahead.
John, I admire your work tremendously. I think it's the first time I've disagreed with you, but that is manifestly inconsistent with history. I did some research on this, and the pile of transit plans that the province has promised and never delivered is like this. It's enormous. You can look back at David Peterson, Bob Ray. Bill Davis was the only one who really had a long-term vision and got to execute it, probably because his Conservative government was in power for 43 years. That problem of change of direction comes at both orders of government. And I just very strongly believe from a democratic perspective, the people of Toronto should be the ones who are electing the people that are going to decide where the future of our transit is going to be, because it's their transit system we're building.
Jennifer.
Well, you only have to go 8 years ago. What was the first thing Doug Ford did when he took office? He put all the LRT lines on hold. He put all of them on hold. Hamilton went on hold for 2 years. There was a massive fight in Hamilton about the LRT line. So I don't think any level of government is immune to that kind of politicking around transit. But I do think that what we're talking about here are some really fundamental governance questions that I don't think we have yet resolved. And even as we were advancing the Eglinton LRT, there were enormous unresolved governance questions about who was operating the LRT, what the interface between the TTC and Metrolinx was going to be.
That sounds like plumbing. People don't care about plumbing, they care about the outcome.
People don't care about plumbing, but the issue here is about the governance, who's making the decisions. I can fully agree with David. I don't actually think that anything has gotten better by changing, moving the governance around and saying these people are going to make decisions instead of these people hasn't actually resolved our transit delivery in any way. And there's the planning question. What is it that we're going to build? And that's tied to the vision of the kind of city that we're trying to create. But then there's also the question of the construction. Who's building it and who's leading the construction? That's a whole other question. And then there's the question of the operations. And the challenge is we have a major operational crisis in transit in the city of Toronto right now. We're underfunding operations. I was on the TTC today. I sat there for 10 minutes debating, do I get off the subway? Do I stay on the subway? Well, there was some shutdown, some, switch wasn't working somewhere.
Happens every day.
It happens every day. So you can build all the lines that you want, but if the subway's running every 10 minutes or it's breaking down every, multiple times per trip, that's another key governance issue.
John.
Well, just to add to, I think what both of you said, the other part of it that is increasingly conspicuously problematic is the fact that we live in a region which has wall-to-wall, 905 to 416 to more 905 traffic, inadequate transit. We have strange transit projects that go out to the 905, like the Yonge Subway North Extension. And it feels like on the one hand, you need to think about the region as a region, and the question of governance is, do you have like a regional governance of the transit network, or do you have some sort of layered thing? How do they work together? And I don't think that's actually in play. And one of the things we're talking about now is this inane idea of the big tunnel underneath the 401 as a way of relieving traffic, and we should be talking about better east-west transit corridors.
So when you say inane, do I put you down as being undecided on this thing?
Yeah, the only thing I'm undecided about is whether the cost will be more or less than $300 billion.
It's actually monstrous, and I think it links into this bigger question, which is, what's our vision as a region? What's our vision as a city? What are we seeking to achieve? Because your infrastructure then becomes an overlay on top of that delivers certain objectives around social equity, around sustainability, around quality of life. And right now at the provincial level, we have two competing visions. The line to Vaughan, the extension to Vaughan of the subway, amazingly, we've built that infrastructure, but we actually shut down the line on the weekends. We actually reduce service significantly because there's simply no demand, which just shows there's enormous. The entire system actually subsidizes that extension out to Vaughan. The King streetcar subsidizes that extension because the ridership is so high. So I think the problem is it's a problem of what are we trying to create here in this region and how do we want to live? And the tunnel is a perfect example of having no idea. Is the goal to move cars? Is that the goal? It's not going to move more people.
I think it's to give you a big bike lane for your bicycle. Isn't that what they want the tunnel for? David Miller, let me get you back in here with just a few minutes to go here. And that is, we saw the difficulties in Ottawa with their LRT as it tried to find its way. Eventually, it's gotten better, but boy, that was a real bumpy ride for the start. Eglinton Crosstown still hasn't opened. Do people in decision-making positions yet understand what has gone wrong with these projects so we don't keep making the same mistakes again if we ever want to build more lines?
That's a hard question to answer because not in those rooms, but I think from the outside, the answer is no. Because really the problem is pretty simple. the province needs to step back a little bit and recognize that it has a coordinating role, and because it collects sales and income taxes, a funding role. But these decisions about technology and route are best made locally. And I think there needs to be a collective recognition that the PPP model has failed, particularly for really big projects like the Eglinton Crosstown. It just doesn't work. You know, the TTC had a pretty good track record, not perfect, but a pretty good track record of building infrastructure. And one of the things, if you have public ownership of the building of infrastructure, you can keep that going and do what we all recognize needs to be a part of this, which is keep building a little bit each year. So I don't think the system has recognized that yet, because there's a lot of pressure from the private sector to do the PPPs. But when it does, you know, we can build capacity, certainly in Toronto, internally like we used to, and really excel again at thinking about networks and being able to build each year rather than having these big projects that come all at once. I think that's the ideal. And frankly, Metrolinx has been a failure in so many ways. You could write a book about how poorly it manages these projects, about its lack of understanding of what an urban transit network is all about. The airport train, for example, they had glossy magazines and fought like mad against the idea there should be a stop at Bloor Street, and had to relent only when the province made them. They're just not set up to do this right. And I don't think that lesson's been learned yet, because the province likes having its agency run things, but that's what's clear to me, certainly from the outside.
I think you just gave John Lawrence's next book idea. Anyways, thanks so much, everybody, for joining us on TVO tonight. David Miller, the former Toronto mayor, Jennifer Keesmath, former chief planner of the city, John Lawrence, urban affairs journalist. Great to have you all with us on TVO tonight.
Thanks so much, Steve.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.
Viola McMillan, owner of Windfall Oils and Mines, was a rare woman in the Canadian mining industry. In 1964, after 3 decades in the business, she became the central figure in a Timmins mining scandal that led to regulatory changes at the Toronto Stock Exchange and the Ontario Securities Commission. Author Tim Falconer tells her compelling story in his new book, Windfall, Viola McMillan and Her Notorious Mining Scandal. And Tim Falconer joins us now for more. Welcome.
Great to be here.
I should mention John Michael McGrath, one of our own, TVO's own, also helped to research this book. We'll talk a little bit about the research because there's a lot of that involved in this. So tell us a little bit about Viola. Born in Muskoka, how did she get to mining? What was her path?
So she grew up on a farm. She was the 13 of 15 children. The farm is now part of the Windermere Golf Course for anybody who plays golf up there. She had to drop out of school at age 12 to help out on the farm, but she dreamed of being a stenographer. She thought that was the most glamorous thing in the world. She managed to get her high school and went to North Bay originally, but her family couldn't afford to send her to business school. She ended up in Windsor, went to business school, ended up working for a law firm.
All right.
She meets a guy named George MacMillan, and he's got an uncle who's a prospector. So one summer they go up to help out with to what's called assessment work. You have to work on your claims to keep them. And she falls in love with it. And then in the early part of the Depression, she was doing real estate and selling Christmas cards, and things aren't going. She tells George, I'm going north. If you want to come, great. Otherwise, I'll be okay. And they both go up there, and they have no money, but they're staking claims and selling them and making a little bit of a living. But she discovers that she's really good at the business side of mining. She opens an office first in Timmins, and then a few years later, in about 35, she opens an office in Toronto. And so she's got the two sides of mining that she loves both. And she would have said that she was just as good as prospector as a business person, but she was better at that side of it. And by the late 40s, she had her first operating mine. In the 50s, she added more. She was a really successful woman in mid-century Canada when women didn't really work outside the home, or if they did, they were school teachers or nurses.
Right.
In 1953, there were 3,700 women who made $10,000 or more, and that's equivalent to about $100,000.
Right.
So it was very difficult for women, and yet she did it in probably the most male industry possible.
I am curious about sort of that time, the constraints. I'm curious, what constraints did Viola face as a woman in a male-dominated industry? Because you mentioned that one trip to a particular mine with her uncle. Correct me if I'm wrong, she wasn't allowed, really.
She wanted to go underground because her brother had worked there until he died of the Spanish flu, and she wanted to go see where he worked. And they said, no, it's bad luck. And this was a long
As a
thing.
woman, it was bad luck.
To have a woman go underground was bad luck in a mine. And she, because she had certain powers of persuasion, convinced him, like, okay, I'm tiny, I'll look like a little boy, I'll put my hair up under my helmet. And she went down. And she thought mining was the most glamorous thing. Even though she said, these would be horrible places to work, but she just fell in love with the industry and started to learn about it. And so she was really an evangelist for mining, particularly prospecting, and she became the president of what was originally called the Ontario Prospectors and Developers Association. It's now known as PDAC, or Professional Developers Prospectors and Developers Association of Canada. She became the president in 1944. And she held that position for 21 years.
Wow.
And, it was practically a male fraternity when she started.
Boys Club.
And she turned it from just like a loose collection of prospectors who are all individualists and into this quite powerful national organization.
I am curious for people, I can imagine we probably have a few prospecting and mining experts who watch our program regularly, but for people who are not familiar, how was mining and speculation around mineral finds different then? Because as you mentioned, she was comfortable getting dirty as well, but what was it like to actually get out there into the woods and start mining?
Well, the first thing you had to do was stake a claim. So this was a quarter of a mile by a quarter mile, 40 acres. And so you had to put a big post at each of the corners and then go and get it registered. And then you had to do this assessment work. You had to go and work on it, and you banged rocks, and you dug trenches so you could see the rock underneath the soil. And, all these things, you're trying to find an ore body. And so she enjoyed that part of it too. And one of the things, they would stake claims and then sell them. If they thought there was something, they would try to hold on as long as they could, but that took lots of money. So that's where the developer side comes in, that they had to raise money. And so these penny stocks, and they had these underwriting agreements which allowed, and they were a little bit, they were supposed to raise money for the company, but really the developer was the one who got all the money.
Who got all the money.
So she was very good at that.
All right, before we talk about the scandal your book is based on, give us a little idea, a brief history of sort of the big mining finds in Timmins. I know you talk about Timmins, you mentioned, there's Cobalt, there's also Kirkland Lake as well, Porcupine. But what was Timmins was booming in and around this time?
Well, it had been, like you're talking in 64? Mm-hmm. Yeah, it had been. So there was a cobalt silver boom in 1903, which was the first big mining thing in Ontario, and really created mining in Ontario and created this stock exchange in Toronto as a mining center. And then followed the Porcupine, which out of that came Timmins, and then Kirkland Lake were the three big finds in Ontario. The Porcupine one gave us companies people might remember, like Dome Mines and Hollinger Mines. And it was a big, big gold community or area, and Timmins was the big town. It was sort of falling on hard times in the early 60s. The mines were coming to the end of their life. And then Texas Gulf Sulfur, a big American company, finds this massive copper, zinc, and silver mine 20 minutes outside of Timmins. And this sends Timmins, the stock market, and prospectors into a frenzy. As like, all like, oh, because in all the other finds, one find led to another, or several others. So everyone was convinced there would be more mines once Texas Gulf announced theirs.
I am curious, currently there's a lot of talk about our neighbors to the south, with the U.S. having interests in minerals around the world. I am curious, back then you had mentioned Texas Gulf founded that mine in Kidd Creek. How did that even happen? How was it that an American company comes in? Just for people to understand that, that was open.
Yeah, they decided to do a big throughout the Canadian Shield. And Timmins was just part of it. But the Ontario government was open to this as a way to generate economic activity. And of course they would have preferred a Canadian to own that Kidd Creek mine, but they just wanted mining to generate jobs and money. And so there wasn't, it wasn't until the 70s that Canada sort of became more protectionist. And then, of course, now all the big mining companies like Noranda and Inco, which were the big mining companies when I was a kid, they're all owned internationally. Right. So it's, that was, one of the things was mining minister really wanted Viola and her husband, Windfall, to be a successful mine, because then it would be Canadian owned.
Ground, yeah. All right. Let's look at a clip. This is from June of 1964, as we're going to talk about. 1964 was a big year and really an important one for this story, when Viola appeared on the CBS show To Tell the Truth. Let's have a look at that.
Will the real Viola McMillan please stand up? Well, that's a busy field you've put yourself into, but you've certainly made a success of it, and I wish you continued success.
Thank you.
Continued success. She didn't, maybe she knew, maybe she didn't, but a couple of weeks later, she was at the center of a controversy there. For people who aren't familiar about that show, there's some irony there. Tell me a little bit about sort of the premise of To Tell the Truth.
So it was a game, so it was sort of similar to Front Page Challenge, and people remember that show. A real person and two pretenders would get up in front of four minor celebrities who would ask questions, and they would try to suss out who the real person was. I mean, in Viola's case, only one person did, and he did it because she looked wealthier than the others. But you saw that clip. She's got a string of pearls. She doesn't look like a prospector at all.
No, right.
Where the other two kind of, that could work. And the irony, of course, was that the show was called To Tell the Truth. And then what happens next is she doesn't always tell the truth.
Well, tell us about that. How did the scandal happen? What was it?
So a few weeks after that, I go back to the Texas Gulf thing. Once Texas Gulf had found its huge mineral deposit, it kept it quiet. And they tried to lock up all the land around their mine, because they assumed that there would be others as well. Because of a staking error, there were 4 claims that Texas Gulf wanted that they didn't get. Biola McMillan knew the prospectors who got them, and she went to Timmins and she bought them. She bought them personally and then sold them to Windfall Oils and Mines, which was a company that she controlled with her husband, George. So everyone was saying, well, if there's going to be another mine, she's got a really good chance at it. And a couple of weeks after she's on that show, they begin drilling on one of their claims. A few days into drilling, George stops the drill. He says that he wanted a core shack. Basically, there would be a little building where you could keep the core, the rock that the drill pulled out of the ground. But of course, that just started rumors like, oh, they've got something. You know, if they need to build a core shack, they've got valuable
Because
stuff.
that core would be able to show if there's trace amounts of minerals.
Absolutely. And so on the Friday, the stock had been trading at 55, 60 cents. On Monday, so he stopped the drill on Sunday. On Monday, it opened at $1 and it continued to go up. And over the next 3 weeks, it bounced around, but it got as high as $5.70. And this was huge news. Like everybody was like, oh, got to get in on this one. People wanted this stock. And, well, I don't know. Do you want me to tell what?
I think let's do it.
So the Toronto Stock Exchange is saying you've got to release statement. You've got to, do you have assay results? But, you got to say something. And she just didn't want to say anything. Finally, after 3 weeks, they get the results. They got nothing. So they have to put out a press release, and of course the stock
plummets.
Lots
of money lost.
In 3 weeks, she made $1.5 million, which would be equivalent to about 10 million today, and other investors lost $2.5 million, equivalent to 25 million.
I imagine we'll talk a little bit about sort of what happened to her, but out of that investigation came some recommendations and changes to the Toronto Stock Exchange and the Ontario Securities Commission. What were they?
So this was such a big deal that Ontario Premier John Robarts appointed a Royal Commission. And the Royal Commission had all sorts of recommendations for training and tightening up the rules. And, basically the TSC and the OSC had to sort of clean up their act. He called the TSC, they operated like a private gaming club. And but one of the big consequences, they pushed all the speculative mining stocks out, and they all went to Vancouver, which then in the 80s, the Vancouver Stock Exchange was known as the scam capital of the world. So I think it was really important. Even today, the Toronto Stock Exchange is the 8th largest stock market in the world, but it has the most mining and oil and gas stocks of any exchange. And I think if it hadn't cleaned up its act, it probably would have not succeeded that way. It would not have thrived the way it has. So I think it was, in a way, it was a really important moment for the stock exchange, and Toronto is a financial center.
I think we can get sort of bogged down in that, many people will say this happened quite a long time ago. But to put its seriousness into context, is there a modern version of this scandal? Is this something that still happens?
The obvious one, and it's now a few years old, but Bre-X. But Bre-X they actually put gold in the samples, what they call salting the samples.
Right.
So it was much more of a fraud. This was much more, she kept her mouth shut.
Didn't say anything, right.
And let people's greed and rumor and just let human nature make her a lot of money. The Royal Commissioner basically accused Viola and George of fraud, but they ended up getting off. They were charged and they got off. She did get charged with something called wash trading, which is basically trading with yourself. So she had a company called Golden Arrow, and she had another of her companies sell shares in Golden Arrow to a third company. And because of it was after 64, the Royal Commission, but computers were sort of coming on board, big computers, but they did an analysis of all the stock trading, and they found this. So she was charged with something called wash trading, and she got 9 months. She only served 7 weeks. And that was another scandal for the Ontario government because everyone said, one law for the rich and another law for everybody else.
Very interesting. And with that as well, she managed to, some would say, sort of recover her reputation in some way. She goes on later to be awarded the Order of Canada as well. How did she rehabilitate her reputation?
Well, she kept a low profile for a long time. She got a pardon in 78. Pardon doesn't mean you're innocent. She talked about it as if if it did, but it really just means that your record is wiped clean. And then she was inducted in the Mining Hall of Fame, and then on her 90th birthday, she got the Order of Canada.
I did mention off the top, the research. This is a very well-researched book. You had mentioned, the headlines. This was top story, front page news. What was the process like for the research? How difficult was it?
Quite easy. There's the Royal Commission transcripts. The OSC had an inquiry, and I have, the Ontario Archives up at York. All those transcripts are there. So I just went up there and, with my phone, scanned every page, and then went home and read them. There are 66 boxes of her papers and stuff in an archive in Gatineau, Quebec. And then there were a million articles. The Toronto Star used to have a supplement called the Star Weekly. They did a profile of her every few years.
Right.
So, and she was written about from the 30s. She was like the late 30s. She was written about frequently. Then she would do radio. When TV happened, she would.
She never turned down an interview.
Yeah, I mean, the mining reporters didn't really like talking to her because she would never answer her questions. But if it was about her or about mining, yeah, she was great. She was very good with the media.
All right, in our last 30 seconds, what do you hope people take away from your book?
I hope that they enjoy reading about a really fascinating woman.
All right. Tim, we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it, and a really great read. Thank you.
Thank you.
If you've been outside in North America lately, then it's likely that you run into Bronta canadensis, the Canada goose. But wait, are they Canada geese or Canadian geese?
The answer to that question is Canada geese. They do not hold passports, and they ignore international borders, but we refer to them as Canada geese.
That's Matthew Oliski, Executive Director of the Jack Miner Migratory Bird Sanctuary in Kingsville, Ontario. He's Team Canada Goose. And what about Jack Miner? You can probably guess how he felt.
Jack Miner loved the Canada goose for its unconditional devotion to its family and to its mate. And so, it's really neat during nesting season to see that species sacrifice so much for its young and for its loved ones and for its flock. So there is that beauty of nature that can be observed if you take a second of your day to notice it. And it is not absent from my mind that Canada geese can certainly come with their own complexities, especially when we're talking about urban populations.
Not everybody loves Canada geese the way that Jack Miner did.
I don't think that there are many people out there that have an undying love for the Canada goose.
Across the border in Michigan, the state is changing the way it deals with nuisance geese. Relocation is out. Guess what's in? Jared Duquette is a human and wildlife interaction specialist with the Michigan DNR's Wildlife Division.
Not only do you have lots of geese, but you have that additive, feces kind of mess, right? It's gross.
Barbara Avers is a Michigan DNR waterfowl and wetland specialist.
Most of our urban areas in the state, I'd say that they're experiencing some sort of Canada goose conflicts.
Some of the challenges we see with managing Canada geese, probably the biggest one is just how many are out there.
The Canadian Wildlife Service estimates that there are at least 7 million Canada geese in North America. In Michigan alone, there are about 281,000 geese, far more than the target population of 225,000.
And when you have these larger goose populations locally in relation to the same place where you have larger human populations, that's where the conflicts occur.
The problem is that humans and geese tend to like the same kinds of places, like lawns and waterfront parks and golf courses. People and geese get together in those places and they don't always get along.
A lot of people come with, really poor experiences of engaging with the Canada goose.
One big issue? Goose poop. Canada geese poop about every 12 minutes, and that adds up to a pound or two of poop every day from every bird. Those droppings can contain E. coli bacteria, which can make people sick or wash into the water and lead to beach closures.
And anyone who's ever been menaced by an angry goose in a parking lot knows that they can be downright aggressive. Maybe you've seen videos on social media or even on the news, like this story from WXYZ Detroit.
A goose on the attack. The goose caught on camera and catching a student off guard.
Look closely as the student tries defending himself, only to get accosted a second time.
You kind of see this exclusion kind of behavior going on, and not only with amongst themselves, but with people. And that's where we get those conflicts sometimes.
The aggression sometimes during that breeding season, that can be one of the conflicts that people have, is just if a goose nests near a building, let's say, right, near a business or something, and, you know, people are trying to get in and out, or an apartment building, those geese can be pretty aggressive and kind of attack people. Of course, we also have farmers. Geese can come in, especially when the crops are just emerging, and, you know, geese can be eating those. Of course, airport safety is another big one.
A commercial aircraft, a U.S. Airways flight from New York to Charlotte, lands in the Hudson River in New York City. And amazingly, all the passengers got out alive. Tonight,
you might remember this news story from NBC Nightly News of Flight 1549 making an emergency landing in the Hudson River in 2009. Well, according to the National Transportation Safety Board's accident report, that happened after both of the plane's engines ingested at least 2 Canada geese weighing about 8 pounds each.
The report also says, quote, Canada geese are particularly hazardous to aviation because of their large size, flocking behavior, attraction to grazing sites at airports, and the year-round presence of their resident populations. But in a way, we have only ourselves to blame. Over the years, we've made North America into a pretty appealing place for geese.
Maybe we would have a bit more patience for them. If we understood that the reason that they're flocking to cities and hanging out beside us while we're trying to, you know, enjoy a moment with our family, picnicking in the grass, if we understood that they're there because geese love fresh cut grass, it's like candy to them.
The spaces we've created, lawns, parks, golf courses, airports, they're basically goose paradise. So now what do we do?
Like a lot of things, I'm a big believer in preventative medicine. And I think that's the same thing in wildlife conservation a lot, is we do have some tools out there where we try to prevent these things like feces from kind of adding up in areas that people want to be. I've been working with a few very urban municipalities here in Michigan. One municipality, they have a park that gets about 60,000 visitors a year, so pretty intensive, but they have lots of geese there. And they're like, what can we do at this little site? And so we're actually partnering right now to test like an autonomic laser that works. We program it to work on various locations, and it just runs itself off of solar power, and geese hate lasers. So it's kind of cool, innovative way to do this, and we're seeing pretty good success at that little site.
If there are no lasers handy, specially trained dogs can also drive geese away from a specific area. In Ontario, the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority is also employing a suite of techniques. This includes managing geese habitats by planting shrubs in areas where they gather, and controlling their population by removing eggs or even entire nests. In late June, Canada geese undergo an annual molting phase where they lose their flight feathers, making it an ideal time for the TRCA to round the geese up and relocate them. But these days, there's a good reason to be cautious about moving geese around.
Keep in mind that everyone is still dealing with and managing the avian flu epidemic.
Avian flu, or bird flu, is a virus that usually spreads among birds. But the highly pathogenic H5N1 subtype of the virus has infected not only birds, but also dairy cows, other mammals, and humans. Millions of chickens have been culled to control outbreaks, and experts worry that a mutation could allow the virus to spread between humans and cause a pandemic. Overpopulation of Canada geese increases that risk, as they can spread the virus to other animals. And that's why Michigan changed its policy from relocation to euthanasia.
It's a real threat to our domestic poultry industry. And also now we do have highly pathogenic avian influenza in some of our dairy herds. We don't want to be potentially increasing the risk of the spread of that virus by moving birds around the state, which means that birds that are rounded up do have to be killed. We're hoping many people will choose to try to get them processed and get the meat distributed to charitable organizations. And I do want to mention why that's a big change, and I want to make sure we talk about why that change is happening. And really that relocation has just become unsustainable.
With relocation off the table and no natural predators to control the population, it falls to us humans to do it ourselves.
Hunting is that tool that we need, and without that tool, we would have even more birds on the landscape, more conflicts to deal with. And so it really is, that's another part of it too, is just understanding that role of hunting and how important it is to the management of our wildlife resources.
Hunters are some of the greatest conservationists out there, some of the strongest advocates for habitat and wildlife conservation and restoration. And the act of hunting waterfowl and recovering bands and sharing that information with the scientific community is incredibly important, and it informs policy that is tied to migratory birds.
And that is the agenda for Thursday, June the 5th, 2025. Tomorrow on the program, John Michael McGrath and yours truly will look at a salary bump and a new pension plan for Ontario MPPs. And we hope you'll join us for that. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.